This is on technology policy. We have another excellent group of witnesses, and we're going to start with Elliott Cohen, a lieutenant with the Maryland State Police. But first, I want to turn to Ron Davis, our executive director, for a brief announcement.
So, thank you, Madam Chair. And if I say this wrong, for those that are into social media, I apologize. I just want to remind people, please feel free to use our hashtag at policing, hashtag policing task force. And you can also follow us on post on Facebook at Police Task Force. Thank you.
So, Mr. Cohen, let's begin with you.
Okay, I'd like to thank the panel first for allowing me to speak with you on this important topic. I'd like to start off with co-evolution of policy and technology. It's a critical part of building that public trust. Law enforcement law enforcement professionals are required to implement the technologies that are often seen through media, TV, the internet, and oftentimes we just don't have the means. But failing to adapt to what the public's expectations are and incorporating that into policy calls for a greater opportunity for distrust and confusion and misrepresentation as to how we accomplish our goals, which ultimately is to serve the public. Inherently, law enforcement professionals want to do what's right and do what's just. Most oftentimes, they're using what tools and knowledge they've either been trained to use or they have readily available. Example, implementation of non-lethal technologies. It's a priority topic, but when a law enforcement officer is on patrol, they may only have 3 options, one being pepper spray, one being an expandable baton, and the other being a firearm. In a situation like that, if the threat is greater than the 2 lowest level forms of tools that they have, it leaves one left to use. And even if not utilized, the perception of even drawing that device out, that tool from a holster, gives a perception that that was the first choice. The utilization of emerging technologies is a wide scope. It doesn't just fall within body cameras, tasers. It's a whole wide variety of tools that we use. The excitement of this is mutual between the public and law enforcement. Law enforcement sees it as a new toy, and that's really dumbing it down, but in actuality, law enforcement, they don't receive many new things, and we're talking about the officers who are making contact with the public, the individuals who represent the department, the political environment of the city, the county, and the state. And everything they do, everyone in government is judged by. So we can't give them more money. We can't give them more days off because of limited resources, limited personnel. So when they do have a new tool, there is a sense of excitement. But on the same token, with every new mobile device that's developed, every mobile technology that makes it readily available to share information, visual or audio, it's exciting to use. It's exciting for the public. It's also exciting for law enforcement, where we also might inappropriately use that technology, which policy will address. And when I say misappropriately use, at times we might just do a search on YouTube and find that maybe a law enforcement officer actually recorded the person themselves traveling at a high rate of speed and posted up to a social media environment. There should be policies in place to address that. So the implementation of policy with technology isn't just strictly building a community trust with instances of force, but just building that public trust that we're doing the right things all the time, even in instances where we don't believe we're being viewed or recorded. The failure to define policy leads to allow employees to utilize more of their own discretion and opinion rather than what the best practices are. So the implementation of emerging technologies, whether it's for personal use representing the department, the agency, should be spelled out clearly enough so that the employee understands that there's an impact greater than the moment that it's used. And I would encapsulate that in unintended consequences. Some of the technologies that we need to focus on is this concept of open data. Now, how does that apply to instances of force? But the transparency in the way we do our jobs, transparency in the number of times we have contact with individuals, the number of times that an individual may have been taken into custody, would allow the public and those who are viewing the actions of law enforcement to have a better understanding of what led to maybe this situation further down the road. The technology needs to be mutually beneficial. It needs to support the public trust and police, law enforcement operations. That is a delicate balance. We can accomplish some of these by setting incremental goals and measured assessments. We're talking about a process of which it's defined that there are checks and balances in policy. Having it codified in policy that you will do this check at this interval, and then we will measure that against historical information of the same data. Several examples of where we want to incorporate policy is what I'll encapsulate in crowdsourcing. We know that it's social media. The validity of that information, we just don't know. But oftentimes it's scrutinized or misrepresented. But what we do know for sure is that it's disseminated and spoken about instantaneously. Another area of technology that supports the building of trust with community is actually attacking the crime at its source. Oftentimes when we have contact and there's instances that bring a negative light on the department or those who govern that department, it's because we're dealing with one of the rogue individuals involved in criminal activity. By involving emerging technologies with better data sharing processes, we could focus on those individuals who are truly perpetuating the crimes that cause us to engage in activities that diminish the public trust. One type of data sharing tool that we use and in my region would be secondhand property. Most of our crimes that we're dealing with originate from the theft or the burglary, to take those goods and trade them for profit or finances to support either a criminal organization or an individual with a substance abuse problem. The continued failure to address the substance abuse problems, in addition to not being able to share data to track down those individuals who are sharing and profiting off of these stolen items, creates an environment where it's okay. And it's an area where we find difficult to police.
30 seconds.
Within policy, sound policies should discuss open communications, effective training, and partnerships. Law enforcement technology impacts both security, privacy, and rights of the public, and they should also be addressed within policy. The public expects what they believe law enforcement has the ability to do. Public opinion is shaped, unfortunately, by misinformation, but by demystifying how we do our jobs through policy and making it publicly available, whether it be online or through open forums, takes away any question as to how we're doing, what we're doing, and why we're doing it that way. Policy for evolving technologies builds a foundation and culture towards self-accountability. The implementation of policy for self-accountability is what's going to help build that public trust. A demonstration of that will be the willingness to decommission an activity or a technology once it's satisfied with its goal or its intended goal. Thank you.
Thank you. Now we have Madhu Grewal, who is the Policy Counsel for the Constitution Project.
Thank you. On behalf of the Constitution Project, I'm grateful for the opportunity to address this task force. Bring this closer, sorry. Okay, is that better? All right. In light of the tragic deaths of Michael Brown, Eric Garner, John Crawford, Tamir Rice, Ayanna Jones, Rakia Boyd, and too many others like them, the nation is paying special attention to our criminal justice system and the relationship of communities and law enforcement. The Constitution Project is well known for issuing policy reports that are guided by several bipartisan and diverse committee members who push for practical reforms to protect constitutional rights. Recently, TCP convened a committee on policing reforms made up of law enforcement, legal scholars, community advocates, judges, prosecutors, public defenders, and a full list of these members is available on our website. This committee has submitted 2 policy briefs to the task force and recommendations in the last few weeks. The first is a background paper and guidelines for the use of body-worn cameras by law enforcement. And the second is a policy brief regarding the constitutional implications of the use of military force and equipment by law enforcement. The task force is also encouraged to review our earlier report, Guidelines for Public Video Surveillance, a guide to protecting communities and preserving civil liberties, which raises some of the concerns we hear regarding body-worn cameras. I've brought all copies of all 3, which are available at the registration table. Body-worn cameras have gained increased attention and use among law enforcement professionals. It's also important to note, as other panelists have, that body cameras are not the sole solution to issues that we're seeing on the ground today. The use of technology for law enforcement surveillance and observation is not new. In the early 1990s, dashboard cameras emerged as a means of capturing real-time encounters between the police and public. Despite early resistance, dashboard cameras gained widespread acceptance as research demonstrated positive impacts on officer safety, accountability, and a reduction in agency liability. Closed-circuit surveillance systems have also become increasingly popular, prompting TCP to issue our video surveillance report. And of course, the use of smartphones has also dramatically increased citizens' ability to film police officers. Law enforcement agencies are also increasingly recognizing the potential for video footage to assist with prosecuting crimes and fostering accountability and professionalism. Given the limited time I have here today, I just want to quickly outline TCP's recommendations. Many of our recommendations contain a number of detailed subpoints from which I'm time limited from discussing today. So I encourage you to read our policy paper for additional details and background information. First and foremost, we recommend clearly detailed written policies that discuss how body-worn cameras are to be used and how the footage is to be maintained. Body-worn cameras should be introduced and implemented incrementally, starting with pilot programs and soliciting feedback from both law enforcement personnel and community members. Policies should be posted online for community members to understand and review. Ongoing consultations with officers and community members will allow for adjustments to policies to balance accountability, transparency, and community relationships as programs develop. Next, issues regarding when to record. Written policies should set clear rules regarding the types of interactions that are to be recorded and when such recording must begin and end. The benefits of body cameras are undermined when recording is simply discretionary, and any such policies should be rejected. Additionally, there's a number of issues that should be considered in detail by agencies and laid out in written policies before implementation, such as rules regarding notification to individuals who are filmed, when to obtain consent, such as before recording victims, particularly in rape and domestic violence cases, exceptions to recording, such as during strip searches, or when officers are in a home where a heightened right to privacy exists, and officer requirements regarding documentation when a camera is deactivated in situations that otherwise require it to be recorded. There should also be clear consequences for missing footage. Policies should be written and clear about officers' obligations to record and store footage and the potential administrative penalties for violating this recording policy. There must also be clearly defined rules regarding how to maintain and when to delete such data. Certain footage should automatically be flagged to keep and retain, such as those involving a use of force incident or where a formal or informal complaint has been registered. The chain of custody must also be clearly preserved and recorded, and policies should clearly describe the responsibility of officers to turn in footage. This method of storage must also be secure and safe from data tampering, and there must be an effective audit and review system in place and clear policies on who may access this data and when. Written policies should also clearly state the length of time when that data should be retained and when it may be deleted. For example, most existing policies retain non-evidentiary footage between 60 and 90 days. Evidentiary footage that's part of an investigation should be maintained until the investigation and ensuing litigation is concluded. In serious felony cases resulting in the conviction and a sentence of a number of years or imposition of a death sentence, this footage should be retained indefinitely. Agencies must also consider who should have access to this massive collection of data. I've heard other panelists discuss today, and I want to underscore that agencies should be aware of when they must disclose data to the public. Policies should specifically outline who in the agency is responsible for complying with open records requests. And written policies should clearly outline the access of supervisors. For example, they must be allowed to review officer footage, such as to investigate a complaint against the officer or a specific incident in which the officer was involved, or to identify videos for training purposes. And finally, an important note on training. Training should be required for all law enforcement personnel who wear cameras or will have access to video footage, including supervisors and auditors. Training should address all practices included in the agency's written policies, including an overview of relevant state laws and department policies and scenario-based exercises that replicate situations officers may actually face in the field. I just want to conclude by emphasizing that there remains insufficient empirical research to fully support or refute many of the claims made about body-worn cameras. Further research is essential. I also want to mention that the role of community input cannot be understated. One of the core functions of body-worn cameras is to improve trust. Therefore, input from community members must be sought on an ongoing basis as policies are developed and implemented. Additionally, researchers should examine all aspects of technology and include citizen surveys to capture perceptions of the technology and its effect on trust in law enforcement. Police departments implementing body-worn cameras should be flexible in the development of their policies and willing to learn from other departments and make adjustments as needed. We realize as more stakeholders weigh in, more agencies adopt this technology, and more empirical research is conducted, new questions will arise. The Constitution Project and its Committee on Policing Reforms will continue to engage with policymakers to discuss the recommendations in our policy briefs. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Our next panelist is Bill Schrier. Bill Schrier is Senior Policy Advisor for the Office of the Chief Information Officer for the State of Washington. Welcome.
Thank you, Chair Robinson. And being from Seattle, I have a presentation. There's a certain technology company up there that makes this particular software. Also, I believe an image is worth 1,000 words, as you probably heard multiple times this morning with body-worn video. Just a couple of things on this slide. I'm speaking from my experience, and I spent 8 years as the Chief Technology Officer for the City of Seattle, working with 3 different police chiefs. So some of what I'll say is informed by that. I also chair the State Interoperability Executive Committee, which is concerned about interoperability of radio systems for law enforcement and other first responders. Here's the legal jargon, a legal gobbledygook, which I made up myself. It's not an attorney's statement. The important thing here is that I'm speaking from my experience and my opinions. I'm not representing the people of the state of Washington or the city of Seattle, Governor Inslee, or Mayor Murray of the city of Seattle. I use examples from those locations. So citizen engagement. I think it's interesting that Madhu talked about the need for citizen engagement. And of course, this is the ideal, the Norman Rockwell painting of a white man standing up and speaking his mind. But we know that the reality is much different. The reality is citizens stand up and maybe get 2 minutes or 3 minutes in front of a public meeting to actually engage. And they also get angry. We've seen that many times, that citizens get angry or they get upset. That happens to be a school board meeting, as a matter of fact. And meetings are not the best way to engage citizens. We have new and better techniques today. So I want to illustrate that with this parable. This is actually a photograph of the election of Pope Benedict in 2005 in Rome. And I call your attention to the lower right corner of the screen where there's a single cell phone. Here is the same photograph from the same vantage point for Pope Francis in 2013. In this case, 8 years, now 10 years, and look at the difference. Technology is changing the way we do business today as citizens, for businesses, and could be and is for policing. I thought it interesting that Elliott mentioned crowdsourcing. I'm holding up as an example the West Seattle blog. I happen to live in West Seattle. However, this particular blog has received national attention and national awards because what it does, it actually crowdsources information and puts that information out for citizens. In this particular case, people will submit their own photographs, they'll submit their own information, and the blog editor will post it. You can see there's 52 comments that she curates. She makes sure that those comments aren't profane and that they're germane. And she will actually, you can see at the very bottom, it says 5:18 p.m. police. If you went down further, you would see that she is updating every 10 minutes or 15 minutes. She'll go out, she'll talk to police officers on the scene, as well as citizens to crowdsource this information and put it up for citizens to see. The media are much different today than they were with the newspapers that published once a day years ago. Seattle Police has reflected this. In this particular case, they have SPD Blotter, Seattle Police Department Blotter, which is a blog. It's not a blog about what the chief did yesterday or the latest public relations release. It's a blog about events, incidents, crimes that are happening in a community that is being published by officers in the field. And what they do is they also tweet it out. In this particular case, all I've got to do is get the technology to work for me. There we go. A student was robbed this morning in West Seattle while walking to school. That's a Twitter feed, and it was also hit as a connection to SPD Blotter. I was privileged in 2010 to actually chair a group that published implemented a new computer-aided dispatch and records management system. We gave every officer a laptop computer. Unfortunately, my home was burglarized not too much longer after that. I expected the officer to use that computer when he came out. He actually used a pad and paper the same way I did it 30 years ago, because a laptop computer doesn't work for cops. It does not work in the field. Therefore, that leads to one of my most significant recommendations is that we should equip all police officers with tablet computers, smartphones, and apps, just like FedEx and UPS and other private businesses are equipped today. And it's not just about body-worn or tablets, computers, or smartphones. It's also about a whole variety of other technology, Google Glass, or connected cars, or body-worn video, all of which could be connected wirelessly. However, I'm sorry, it's not moving quite as fast as I had hoped. Does anybody recognize this photograph? Sheriff Schrier does. That occurred a year ago. That's the Seattle Police Department with 300,000 to 500,000 people in downtown Seattle, and it'll be repeated this week after the Seahawks win the Super Bowl. So why is that relevant to this particular panel? Here's why. This is the headline in the Seattle Times the day afterwards. Cell use at Seahawks parade swamped wireless networks. Why is that relevant to policing? Because of this. Who's got priority on networks? My 5-year-old granddaughter using a tablet computer, or first responders? The answer is, on commercial networks, they have equal priority. So we can give tablet computers and smartphones to cops, but that doesn't mean they'll be able to use them when the incidents actually occur. Congress recognized this in 2012. With the Spectrum Act of 2012, they created this entity, FirstNet, a nationwide wireless broadband and data network created to public safety, which is now being constructed in the United States. Well, it actually isn't being constructed, it's being planned. I actually blogged, is FirstNet stalled? Because it is taking so long to get this wireless network going. We don't even have designs for each state yet. It might be later this year that we get an RFP out. When will it be implemented? We don't know. And so that leads to this recommendation. We need FirstNet, which is a part of the Department of Commerce, a federal agency, some exemption from federal personnel rules and the federal acquisition regulation so it can become faster and more entrepreneurial. It needs to be more agile. No offense to the Department of Justice. Department of Justice, Mr. Davis, is very agile. The last thing I'll talk about is the Internet of Things, which is a lot more than body-worn video or video cameras or smartphones and tablets. It's connecting, over the next 5 years, 50 billion things will be connected to the Internet. And they'll include a wide variety of things which are useful in policing. They'll also include apps that can be fairly terrifying, augmented reality or facial recognition. We'll have drones, connected vehicles. We might have driverless vehicles. California just recently authorized that. All of this sort of thing can be connected to the Internet, used for crime, but also used for law enforcement. And that gives rise to something that Madhu and Elliott have both talked about, which is this massive amount of data, this massive amount of video data, 911 data, and everything else that could be potentially disclosed. And it's not just the government that's collecting it. Every time somebody tags a face on Facebook, you are creating a facial recognition database that's being used by that private company. The other thing that I'll mention is, and Sheriff Farrar knows this, the public disclosure laws of Washington State are extraordinarily liberal. I heard some of the testimony this morning. Every video that is produced by a police officer, body-worn or dash cam, has to be disclosed unless it's an active investigation. But what about protecting the privacy of witnesses and others? So protecting privacy is an important consideration in collecting all this data. The recommendations you will be making are extraordinarily important. They will affect citizens, they will affect police officers, and I hope you're engaging officers in the street like Elliott Cohen. I'm glad you are. Those recommendations, however, are nothing without action and communication and funding. Those are everything. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today.
Thank you for your creative presentation. We now turn to our last panelist, however not least, Vincent Talucci, who is CEO and Executive Director, both, for the International Association of Chiefs of Police, IACP. Welcome.
Thank you, and good afternoon. Commissioner Ramsey, Professor Robinson, Director Davis, and members of the Task Force on 21st Century Policing, on behalf of the membership of the International Association of Chiefs of Police, commonly known as IACP, thank you for inviting me to testify today. The IACP is the world's largest association of law enforcement executives with more than 22,000 members in 98 different countries. For over 120 years, the IACP has been launching internationally acclaimed programs, speaking out on behalf of law enforcement, conducting groundbreaking research, and providing exemplary programs and services to the law enforcement profession around the globe. Technology within a law enforcement context is broad and diverse. It ranges from everything from the US DOJ-supported discoverpolicing.org website that focuses on offering virtual ride-alongs and electronic resources designed to help recruit a diverse workforce, to a smart handheld device providing near real-time information to a roadside officer, trooper, or deputy. The depth and breadth of law enforcement technology is clearly on display today. Earlier, you heard from two panels examining body-worn cameras. Moreover, later today, we'll hear of other connective technologies like social media that help bring officers and agencies even closer to the communities they serve. There is no question that new and emerging technologies play an increasingly important role in the daily work of police, equipping officers with advanced tools that have the potential of making them safer, better informed, and more effective and efficient. In a time when law enforcement agencies are typically operating with a reduced force and agencies are asking their officers to respond to an ever-expanding variety of calls for service, the use of technology is not a luxury, but essential. Given calls for greater transparency amid increasing scrutiny of law enforcement operations and performance, particularly in light of recent events, the IACP agrees that, where appropriate, agencies should implement technology that supports and enhances transparency in police-community interactions, so to promote public confidence and aid in a meaningful dialogue between law enforcement and the community. However, it is essential to remember that while technology has proven to be beneficial for law enforcement, hurriedly and improperly deploying and implementing technologies without a thoughtful, comprehensive rollout strategy is extremely problematic. Such a sudden proliferation of a new technology without a much-needed supporting infrastructure will force agencies to address unintended, unanticipated consequences on a rolling, ongoing basis, including playing catch-up on policies, privacy impact assessments, and determining long-term total costs of ownership. Prior to the use of any technology like body-worn cameras, video surveillance systems, and automatic license plate readers, agencies need to have policies in place that govern the deployment and use of the technology. Moreover, the policies must address how the agency will protect the civil rights and civil liberties of individuals, as well as recognize and respect the privacy protections regarding the data collected, stored, and used. Development and enforcement of these policies is essential to effective and sustainable implementation and to maintaining community trust. Given the ever-changing technological landscape and proliferation of new advanced tools, the IACP in 2014 took the lead in developing a technology policy framework, or sort of a checklist, to identify universal principles that can be used as a guide to all law enforcement agencies as they develop effective policies for the use of technologies. Those principles include specification of use, policies and procedures, privacy and data quality, data minimization and limitations, performance evaluations, transparency and notice, security, and last, but certainly not least, data retention, access, and use. While technology has proven to be a useful tool for law enforcement, we also must remember a few things. As Commissioner Ramsey noted earlier, just because a technology can be implemented doesn't mean that it should be implemented. Secondly, technology can both facilitate and inhibit building community bonds. The benefits that technology can bring to law enforcement and their relations with the community can only be achieved through proper planning, implementation, training, deployment, use, and management of the technology and the information it provides. Further, communication with the community regarding a specific technology's purpose and proposed use is an important component. Like all resources and tools available to law enforcement, the use of new technologies must be carefully considered and managed. Agencies must clearly articulate their strategic goals for the technology, and this should be aligned with the broader strategic plans of the agency and the safety needs of the public. Thorough and ongoing training is required to ensure that the technology performs effectively and that users are well-versed in the operational policies and procedures defined and enforced by the agency. Policies must be developed and strictly enforced to ensure the quality of the data, the security of the system, compliance with applicable laws and regulations, and the privacy of information gathered. Building robust auditing requirements into agency policies will help enforce proper use of the system and reassure the public that the privacy interests are recognized and protected. The development of these policies is a proven way for law enforcement executives to ensure they are taking full advantage of technology to assist in providing the best criminal justice services while protecting the privacy, civil rights, and civil liberties of the citizens they serve. Similar to IACP's technology policy framework, another longtime service the IACP provides is developing and refining model policies for law enforcement on complicated issues like the use of technology, including body-worn cameras. Lastly and importantly, we must also be mindful that although the economy has substantially recovered in many communities, state and local governments and their law enforcement agencies are still operating on substantially reduced budgets. If the members of the task force recommend that all law enforcement agencies should acquire certain technologies, there needs to be a resource assistance to do so. Again, thank you for convening this listening session and for the opportunity for the IACP to express its views on the use of technology to aid in the strengthening of community-police relations in the United States. I do hope that you will get a chance to read our technology policy framework and our model policy on the use of body-worn cameras, and I certainly welcome any questions from the task force members. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Talucci, and all of the panelists. And I'm going to turn now to Tracy Mears for our first question.
Good afternoon. Thanks so much for that and very informative and entertaining presentation. Just the thing you need after lunch, I have to say. This question is actually for Ms. Grewal. So I had a chance while you were speaking to look through the materials, and in particular the one on body-worn cameras, although I appreciate the variety of resources that you gave us. As I understand it, I think the Constitution Project considers this sort of an ideal policy. Is that right? Okay, I just want to make sure. And that you think that there should be, mandatory implementation of some of the regulations and the like that you suggest. In our last panel, Sergeant Van Houten discussed having these voluntary approaches, in part because he says Fort Worth was one of the very first movers to do this, and so it's kind of actually hard to figure out what policy you want when you're not even sure how the people who are actually going to use them will take up this technology. So I'm wondering what you think about balancing a sort of ideal policy once things are, have gotten started, against how you will develop policy in the implementation phase, especially given, and I think I got this right, I looked through your appendix, I looked at all the people that you all worked with to develop this, and I don't think I saw any representative of anybody who's actually an officer sort of on the ground. I mean, you have some police executives, but that's a different body of people.
Right, so thank you for that question. So I just want to quickly say that our Committee on Policing Reforms quickly pulled together these recommendations given the limited time presented by the task force. And I know that there's still ongoing research and discussion among committee members to finalize these recommendations. So this is just kind of a start, and we put that caveat in here pretty clearly, that policy recommendations are still continuing to be developed. We just wanted to have something for you to review based on our initial research. So I think, obviously, when people are on the ground and reviewing these ideal recommendations, things are going to change. And that's partly why we included that caveat about continuing to develop these policies and continuing to solicit feedback from community members, officers, those who are on the ground, and really implementing. And that's why we also suggest incremental implementation and starting with pilot programs. So again, these are not policies that should be set in stone, but should be continuing to be developed with the input and guidance from both community members and officers on the ground.
Thanks.
Our next questioner is Roberto Villaseñor.
And I'm going to follow up a little bit also with Ms. Grewal. In looking at the Constitution Project, and you look at your executive summary, it starts out talking about courts, lawmakers, legal scholars have grappled for decades with how best to regulate the use of video. And then the next paragraph, it talks about, but in the last few years, technology has developed at such rapid pace that it's becoming almost an expected tool to be used by law enforcement. And I guess that's some of the concerns and the problems that we're all talking about today, is that we've had some of the most learned people studying this for decades and still have not come up with clear-cut policies, yet we have expectations that law enforcement is going to get this all right the first time we put out a camera out on a police officer. How do you try and reconcile the reality and the expectation?
Thank you. That's a great question, and I think
Thank you.
You hit it. You hit the nail right on the head. We acknowledge that tension between constitutional concerns and safeguards, such as privacy concerns, for particularly, it sounds like you were looking through our video surveillance report, and there were a lot of privacy concerns when closed-circuit cameras came out, and those privacy concerns continue to be discussed and debated, particularly in the academic world. And I can only imagine that as body-worn cameras are implemented across the country at increasing rates, that these are concerns that will increasingly be debated in the academic sphere and also among officers. So you're absolutely right, there's a tension. We don't have a clear answer to that tension except to say that it's something that as policies are being implemented and as police departments are implementing body-worn cameras, that they are aware of these issues, that these issues exist, and that they are acknowledging the tensions as they're moving forward with implementation.
Thank you.
Our next questioner is Jose Lopez.
Thank you. I have a question for Mr. Talucci. Did I pronounce that right?
Correct, yep.
Thank you. So I think I think it was the first, there was a panel, I think it was yesterday, where Jay McDonald was sitting on, and in his statement, what he had said, and I quote, is, "We do not want our officers even for a second to think, quote, how will this look on camera," end quote. And so kind of looking at, I think you're the second person today who presented the data in Rialto and in Mesa. And so based on the data that we're seeing through Rialto, is it safe to conclude, looking at that data, that officers are thinking about the question of how this looks on camera, and that is impacting the way that they take on the task at hand?
I don't know if I would say that that's a foregone conclusion. I think we've heard a number of cases today that research is still substantially required in a lot of the use and sort of mindset that goes into this. I think the behavioral changes, the longitudinal work that we could do is go back and take a look at any behavior changes that happen with other sort of surveillance technologies that got put in place, like in-car cameras, since they've been around. But I don't know if we have enough research to indicate whether the behavior change is a result of the cameras yet. But one of the recommendations that from one of the other panels today would be a substantial increase in research to a National Institute of Justice to take a look at behavior change.
Sue Rohr.
I have a question for Bill. In your written materials, you didn't really get into it too much in your media presentation. You have a recommendation about engaging the street cop, and you talk about an officer engaging in tweeting out information while on patrol. And I'm wondering if you can expand a little bit on what you put in your written report and what the consequences were of that.
Thank you, Sheriff Rohr. I think one of the problems with many departments is that they are very hierarchical and top-down. So things are driven by the public information officer and the chief. And obviously, the work actually occurs on the street. One of the things that I think about in terms of how the work gets done is it's very agile. You expect officers to make decisions, Elliott knows this, based on their training and experience, but they're always in a new situation. It's very agile. And they also speak very well for themselves, some of those officers. So if we can give them voice to speak to the media, to tweet the information out, and occasionally blog about it. Seattle Police actually had a police officer do a Reddit. Reddit's a social media tool, and Ask Me Anything, where he engaged the public. I think it was a man, engaged the public to answer questions. That sort of thing helps build public trust.
I appreciate you bringing that up, because we've spent a lot of time talking about body cameras, and yet we talk about the importance of community engagement. And this is a realm of technology that offers all kinds of opportunities, particularly for younger people, to feel connected to their police department. Even though to us older folks, it seems artificial, to the younger folks, I think it feels more natural. Any fallout from that Reddit Ask Me Anything?
You know, it's interesting because it was contrary to the Seattle Police Department for him to do that, but Seattle Police Department actually embraced it and encouraged him and allowed him to do it. As far as I know, there was no particular fallout other than the engagement that occurred on Reddit.
Thank you.
Tracy Mears.
I think this question is also for Ms. Grewal, or maybe Mr. Talucci, or any of you. But one of the things I realize that we haven't really covered today in discussing the body-worn cameras is what happens when officers wear their own cameras, privately owned cameras, and how we should think about the legal implication of that.
That's an interesting question. We haven't actually addressed that in any of our reports. I don't know if Mr. Talucci has actually ever thought about that.
We haven't looked at that yet either, but it would be an interesting sort of call to call sort of what the anecdotal information's telling us on it. But we haven't in our materials we haven't seen that yet.
Well, our co-chair, Commissioner Ramsey, wants to comment on that.
Great.
I was at a conference, I forget which one, when this was being discussed. And at the time in Philadelphia, we weren't piloting body cameras. And from an agency that did have cameras, he made a comment that made sense to me. Even if you don't have cameras, you need a policy in place to deal with this issue, even if it's prohibiting officers from wearing their own cameras. Because if you don't, you're going to run into problems in terms of retention and all the various other kinds of things that go along with body cameras. So for anyone listening, any of the agencies out here, it would really be wise to have a policy in place, irrespective of whether or not you have cameras at the moment. You need to have something in place, either saying, no, you can't wear your own, or if you do, then here's the process and the procedures, the rules that you must follow.
And if I could add to that, and I believe it was the professor from Arizona State that was sitting in this chair on the first panel, who talked about the model policies that exist. And again, I mentioned in my oral testimony about what we've been doing for more than 2 decades. The IACP is developing model policies, and they're a good framework, but they also need to be adapted for local laws, state laws, local ordinances, restricted policies. But it begins at least the framework to start from. And we distributed that into our entire membership last year to good feedback thus far, given the burgeoning call for body-worn cameras.
And Bill Schrier.
And I just point out that it's more than video cameras. It's also smartphones and tablets.
Right.
So, or any computer. So when you do not issue these devices to an officer, they use their own. And that technically, well, not technically, legally and technically is subject to public disclosure, FOIA, retention, everything you mentioned, Chief Ramsey.
And in the state of Washington, it violates the two-party consent law.
A very good example of that was we had officers that were using it to track stolen cell phones. They were using software in their smartphone to track iPhones that had been stolen to try to apprehend the offender and recover the phone. That's fine, but that's your personal phone. And so now, you know, discovery and all the other things that kick in, you know, you don't necessarily want all of your private information exposed either. So using your own personal iPad or whatever for police work is something that, again, policy, you need to make officers aware of the consequences when they do that.
I just actually want to quickly underscore, I mean, I talked a lot about the importance of written policies and training, and so I think this is a perfect example of before anything is rolled out, that the use of cameras, whether personal or provided by the agency, should be in both written policies but also included in training. So there should be some training on how you're using your smartphone on the job, if you're using your camera, what the implications of that are, including in that officer training, consent laws, that state's consent laws, and what they have to publicly disclose. And I think that's all significantly important for law enforcement agencies to provide that training and written policies to officers.
Thank you.
Yeah. Jose Lopez?
Yeah, I have a question about the Rialto and the Mesa models, and just got me thinking about one of the things happening in New York right now and kind of the challenging the practice of illegal searches and seizures, and then the recommendations made to the courts around how to deal with that. So in Rialto and Mesa, are there any policies already set in place that discuss that idea that if you are recording an incident and you, through an illegal search or seizure, are able to find something on the person that you stop and search, are there any policies around whether or not that can be used in the process through the courts?
I'm not familiar with the operational policy and procedures of Mesa or Rialto. I would.
I think, Tracy, why don't you answer that as a criminal procedure expert?
I don't think you can. Yeah,
Right.
it's not admissible.
Yeah, I would think the same, but I just wondered.
Oh, why don't we move on then? Our next questioner is Brittany Packnett.
So I just had a quick question, continuing on this vein of social media and actually having law enforcement officials tweeting and using other social media devices. What do you suspect or maybe have seen in any of your experiences to be some of the challenges of that, especially when we think about community perception, voice and tone and those kinds of things? What are some of the potential challenges or challenges that you've witnessed, and what are some of the ways that we can mitigate that risk and allow kind of that use to be helpful?
I'll be glad to take the first crack at that. Through the Bureau of Justice Assistance several years back, we stood up a IACP Center for Social Media to essentially provide the infrastructure and information to provide the framework for law enforcement agencies that want to do social media, sort of the how-to, but also taking a look at sort of the pitfalls. Probably the biggest issue is cultural, and I think that is being sort of, it goes away with more time and acceptance. And for instance, I was sharing with several people, my colleagues and I from IACP decided yesterday at the last minute to drive instead of fly out here from Washington, D.C. And the whole way along, we did a tweet along. And it was interesting, but it was to try to get a discussion going. I don't think that would have happened 3 years ago in terms of talking about this, because we were trying to generate information or interest in the policing task force. We were tweeting along different states, sending it to the state association, sending it to the state police as we were going through. But I think it's cultural. I think it's time. I think it's an understanding. It's not something that was a normal technology 5 years ago. But you take a look at the stats from the Center for Social Media, and there's a lot of usage. And bringing the community closer and having that closer dialogue through means is tricky. And I opened up my Twitter account for the first time yesterday, and I'm scared to read the feed after I'm done here. So.
Well, Vince, I'd just like to say on behalf of the Policing Task Force, we appreciate your tweeting support.
Thank you.
Bill, you want to weigh in?
There are myriad of policy issues, and I'll just mention a couple. One is, so do you restrict police officers in their personal use of Facebook, Twitter, off the job this is now, personal use? For example, we have an officer now in Seattle who faces potential discipline because she may have posted disparaging comments on Facebook, gender or race-based. Is that a legitimate, do you have a policy around that? Is that a legitimate reason for discipline? Should officers be restricted? Many teachers, for example, don't use Facebook, so their students don't friend them. So that's one set of issues. Then another set of issues is when an officer tweets, like on a tweet-along, is that an official tweet of the department, or does it represent that individual officer? Certainly would not represent official policy of the department or the city or the county. So that's another potential issue. There's just, it's a great set and a great piece of work for the Constitution Project.
Commissioner Ramsey was going to comment on how his department handles that.
Well, we do have a policy about off-duty use of social media, particularly when officers are identifying themselves as members of the department. And oftentimes that's what they do. They're posting photographs, they're talking about the department, letting people know that they're a member. And if that's the case, then we certainly have an expectation in terms of their conduct. And there have been cases where we have taken disciplinary action against an officer who did engage in inappropriate activity on social media, and it was known that that person was a member of our department.
I just wanted to quickly add, 2 words of caution about just relying too heavily on technology. I think one is, and this was kind of alluded to, but just cultural differences in non-English proficient immigrant communities and how you engage those communities and how you might do that through social media or not. The Constitution Project actually tweets out in Spanish, and so that's something to think about for police departments. And then also responsiveness. Community tweeting can be a really great way to engage with agencies and police departments, but at the same time, if there seems to be a lot of tweeting happening and policies aren't actually changing as a result, you have to look at whether that's actually building trust or leading to some deterioration of trust. So that's just 2 words of caution about becoming increasingly reliant on technology as a means of communicating with communities.
I'd like to speak towards that also. There's an expectation that we have towards officers to build that relationship with their community. And of the approximate 30,000 departments or 38,000 departments that are out there, how many of them are so large that they don't have that connection? They're very few. Most of them have a close connection with their community. They're in the stores. They live in the community of which they're policing. So to have that connection with the community, there's an expectation from that community to engage their officer. It's not the police department's officer. It's that community's officers. We're their police. We belong to the community. So there is an expectation that we engage them in the means that we have available now. And because of the differences in generations, there's also an expectation that we're meeting the bulk of the generations that's using the technology. So the officers, when they're on the scene of something and they clear, there's an expectation that the public, the community, is going to get some information as to what just happened. And you see that now, law enforcement, they are tweeting, they are Facebooking. We have more social engagement with our community because of the technology. So it's important that we do incorporate that. Our department does have a policy on the use of social media, that we're pushed that through the state of Maryland, but it is critically important. Having policies that they have to be carefully structured so as not to alienate the employee from using the means at which they're used to communicate with the community. It makes it very difficult. It's almost as if they're being pulled in 2 directions to accomplish what command is asking them to do. Make that relationship. Let the public see you. Let them know your name. Thank you.
Yeah, that's very helpful. Our last question will be from Sean Smoot.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to the panel of witnesses. I really just wanted to touch on something and make you aware of it. I'm a little bit surprised it didn't come up today. But we saw a tremendous example of the power of social media in probably the most positive way in the wake of the Boston Marathon bombing. And, those of us who were following that very closely from the police, law enforcement side, and handling a disaster side of things, we really saw what a powerful tool social media was, because in the aftermath there were issues with people being able to actually call on their cell phones. The Boston Police Department did a tremendous job of communicating with the various community leaders via social media. They use Twitter quite a bit, and there's a paper that was written about it by the Boston Police Chief or Commissioner and Christine Cole, who ran the executive session process at Harvard's Kennedy School. So I would just make people aware of that, and there's more to it than just the issues that came up today. So.
Oh, yes, Bill.
In all fairness, I did have a photograph of the marathon bombing suspects. I just didn't call it out. But Calgary is another one. Calgary, Alberta has done a phenomenal job using social media to communicate during their floods.
I mean, I think it's a tool too and it was used as a tool in some respects, because we have, situations where our traditional communication devices don't work in the aftermath of a disaster. And it's a potential tool, and it was used in Boston, and it has been used in other situations that I'm aware of to communicate from the department with their members.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you all very much. I ask my colleagues to join me in really applauding our wonderful witnesses.